Hello, friends and family of God here at Beck's Lutheran Church. I thank you for joining me during this weird and difficult season of life as we are called to be apart from one another, not to worship and gather together as we continue to care for others. I really give thanks for all of us and our willingness to be apart, to put the needs and the cares of others, especially those who are the most vulnerable to this virus, to put their needs and cares above our own so that we can make sure that they are okay and we can do our best to help all overcome this burden and this challenge that we are facing. I think it's a very gospel-like thing to do, to care for others before we care for ourselves. And so I thank you for staying at home and distancing yourself as best you can. I know it's weird and difficult, but I really do believe that through this we can save lives and care for one another in ways that might just look different, but are still faithful nonetheless. I stand here in a similar place where I would stand on Wednesday nights for our Lenten midweek services. You know, we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 11 and what it means to have faith these last few weeks. We've talked about Noah's story and Abraham's story last week, and I've loved this opportunity to gather, to sing, and to worship, and to try something new, right? We've been discussing together during this sermon reflection time and having a conversation as a group that I've really appreciated, and that's kind of, I think, what we're lacking the most with this particular type of medium with a video, but we'll try our best to give you a chance to answer a question and reflect and maybe share with people that you might be watching with. So we'll see how that goes, but I'd like to continue by talking about the next person that we're going to talk about. So we'll find that in Hebrews chapter 11 if you haven't read it already. Here we go. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. By faith Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered, as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Here ends the reading. We've been starting our time by asking a question, right? Considering something. And so the question I'd want you to ask, to think about, to reflect on, or even to ask each other if you're watching this with others, that question is simply, how is it that you make the choices that you make? How do you make decisions? And we're not thinking so much about those little micro decisions that we make daily, right? The little ones like what to wear or what to eat or what to watch on TV. Right? I'm thinking those big decisions, the ones that mean a lot and there's things at stake. How do you make those decisions, those choices? What kind of things do you consider or think about? Take a moment and think about that, or ask the people around you, and feel free to pause the video while you do that. I'm guessing, for those of you that discussed this or thought about it or reflected on it, some of the answers that I might have received, right, one way could have been very analytical, right? I make choices by being analytical, right, by thinking of the consequences, the outcomes, right? Whatever it is that's going to happen when I make this choice. And so I'm going to choose I like the better option, right? If I'm going to do this, that's going to result in this, and I don't like that. So if I choose this one and it results in that, then I like that one better, so I'll choose this one instead, right? We think of things analytically or consequentially, right? Like what consequences might happen. Right, you might think of things like process-based, and you might think of plus delta charts or considering every option that you have. But I want to dig a little deeper into decision-making because I think that we all do those things naturally, right? We consider what's going to happen when things happen. But when faced with two options, how do we choose which options are better, even if we've seen the results? Because a typical option might be what's best for me or what's best for others, right? We think of that right now during this time of social distancing. I'd rather be out doing things. I'd rather be here worshiping with you, right? I would rather have that, but we are better off, right? The whole of society is better off if we spend a few days or weeks separated a little bit. So how is it that I make those decisions, right? We're talking about Moses today, and Moses had to make a lot of decisions during his life, right? See, we're going to summarize Moses, and this is where I would ask you to help me retell the Moses story, right? We'd start from when he was born, and we're at this time in Israel's history, right, where they've been enslaved in Egypt, right? They've gone during the time of Joseph, right? Think the coat of many colors and all those things. They've gone, but eventually the Pharaoh dies and a new Pharaoh comes to power, and it's one who does not know Joseph, right? Does not remember Joseph and the positive relationship that Egypt had with Israel. And so at that point we find, this is the beginning of Exodus, right? In the Old Testament, what we then find is eventually, right, the Hebrews are enslaved and put to hard labor. Or they're likely making bricks and building things. They're working long hours. And so the issue might just be that it's not a great place to be in if you're a person of God, or if you're a person of the promise of Abraham, like we talked about last week. These people are hurting, they're enslaved, and reaches a point where the Pharaoh, right, the ruler of Egypt, feels threatened by how many Hebrews there are, right? They're having so many babies, and they're growing into a population that he's scared of. And so a royal edict goes out that they're going to kill the firstborn, right? To kill any of the males, actually, the males that are born to Hebrew women. And so when Moses' mom gives birth to Moses, they hide Moses for 3 months, right? Because the other option is that they're going to throw him into the Nile River to perish in one of multiple ways that could have happened. And so here we have Moses. Eventually, they can't keep him hidden any longer, and so she makes this ark. It's the same word that we used 2 weeks ago with Noah, right? Makes this basket, this ark to put Moses in, and ships him down the river, and his sister is watching over him from a distance, and Pharaoh's daughter is the one that finds him, right? And she has compassion on this little Hebrew boy, and she chooses to raise him as her own in the palace as part of the royal family, we are led to believe. And so here we have Moses beginning a life in the palace, in a powerful family of Egypt, one of the most powerful nations in the world at that time. And Moses would grow up to be part of that, to have access to all the power and privilege that it comes with being a part of the royal family, right? The family of Pharaoh. But we learn in Hebrews that Moses never saw himself completely as an Egyptian, even though people would refer to him as that throughout his story. Instead, he has compassion, right, on his people, right? Our reading from Hebrews says he refused to be known as a child of Pharaoh's daughter, but instead, a person who was one with the Hebrew people, right? One who resonated with the promise, who was part of that promise. And so some choices that Moses has to make, right? Choices come about because of this wrestling with identity. The first that we read about, we find, is when Moses goes and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses is enraged. He has a bit of a temper, and he strikes the Egyptian, ends up killing him, actually. And he buries him in the sand and goes about his day thinking he'd helped a lot. And the next day, the Hebrews are fighting, right? And he's telling them, hey, shouldn't you be more happy about this, etc. And why are you fighting with one another? And these people instead accuse Moses, pretty much saying, well, aren't you just going to strike us down like you did that Egyptian? All right, so that's the first choice that Moses makes, right? And he makes other choices, right? Because of this fear of what he's done, right? He's killed an Egyptian. He's picked a side in this war, in this battle and struggle. Because of this, he fears for his life, and so he leaves the security and safety of Egypt, right? The power that comes with being part of the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian sphere of life, and instead flees to the desert. And he eventually finds a family there and a wife and has children and lives a life there, right? He having forsaken and made a choice to leave Egypt. But eventually God comes to him anyway, right? This is a familiar story, right? This bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. And there's this multiple chapter discussion between God and Moses, right, in chapter 3 of Exodus and through chapter 5, I think. But he has this conversation with God where God tells him that you are called by me. I would like you to go, right? I'm sending you back to Egypt. Can you imagine how he felt being sent back to the place where he felt that he was not safe anymore, the place that he chose to leave, but he's being sent back to Egypt to tell Pharaoh and the powers that be that God's people are to be set free, to let my people go. You can hear the words from some popular movies in our heads, but that's the next choice that Moses has to make, is a choice to answer God's call to go back to Egypt, where people may remember him. It's a different king at this point. It's been 40 years or so, but to go back and to be willing to stand up for God against the most powerful nation in the world at that time, and to stand up for God's people as well. And he makes that decision over and over again to respond in faith to those things, those questions of faith, those moments where he must make a decision. He chooses to stand with God. When he leads God's people out of safety and comfort in Egypt, he leads them instead into a desert, right, through the waters of the Red Sea. He still has to make a choice to continue to trust in God. And so when we think of the choices that we make and we think of what it means to have faith, see, Moses, I think, is a great example, because for Moses had to make hard decisions. And how did he make those decisions? Right? I think he made them on faith. It's faith in God's promise, right? Faith in the promise that we heard about last week, right? With Abraham and the covenant that God made with Abraham and Abraham's descendants, of which Moses is just one part. That promise that God will bless them and God will make them a rich nation, and through this nation, through this family, God will bless all nations and the whole world through them. And he had faith in that promise, right? Because that's the promise that God invokes at the burning bush. It's this promise of, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Tell them that. Tell them that I am the one who sends you. And so Moses trusts in that promise. But also trust, I think, in God's presence with him. See, the writer of Hebrews tells us that it was like he spent time with someone, right? He could see the one who was invisible, right? We know that Moses met with God in multiple times, right? The first being at a burning bush and on top of Mount Sinai multiple times. So what does it mean to live like God is fully present in your life, to make decisions based on the reality and the promise that God is here? See, we as people of faith are assured of that promise in the waters of baptism, that God is with us, God will not leave us, and God will not forsake us. And so when we ask that question of how do we make decisions, right? How is it that faith can be a part of that decision? How is it that our understanding that God is present, that God has made promises to us as people who have been inherited into this promise, right? Grafted into this promise of Abraham to be God's people. But how is it also that we can trust in those promises that we find in baptism, right? That we are loved, that God is with us, and nothing can change that. despite the powers that be and the powers of the devil and the evil one and all those things, that forces that defy God, still we stand assured of the promise that God has made with us and that God has made with all of us as God's people. And so when we make decisions, I want you to think once again, how is it that we make those? Do we make them based on the principles of our society, right? That maybe I am the person that should benefit the most, or I should make the decision that's best for me. But what if we instead made decisions based on the tenets and the principles of our faith? That I should make decisions based on the least of these, or I should make decisions based on the ones who cannot make that decision themselves, or I should make a decision chiefly out of love, not out of fear or hate or those other forces that defy God. What if the choices we make, the decisions we make, were all based on the faith that we have? The faith we have in God, the faith we have in God's promises. So that we, like Moses, when we were faced with multiple decisions that change our lives and affect the very way in which we live, if we made that choice, if we chose something difficult, even maybe risky or dangerous if needed, if we made a choice that said, God is here, God is present, and I trust that God is here with us. Let's say a prayer together. The Lord be with you. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the faith of Moses, for the faith to make difficult decisions, for the faith to be assured that you are here. Help us to trust those promises that you have made, those promises that we are blessings to the world, the promises that we are your children, beloved by you, and the promise that you will never leave us nor forsake us. Give us the faith and the courage to make those difficult decisions when it seems like we should maybe make a different one and the world might be telling us to. Help us to know the correct decisions to make that benefit your will and your kingdom in this place, but also that benefit your people, the people you love, the people most vulnerable. Continue to be with us during these weeks and days ahead. We ask all this in your Son's precious name. Amen. You can continue with the bulletin if you have it. If not, God's grace and peace be with you.